If Julian ever finds out what happened that night, he'll know his mother died because of me.
The woman whispering those words was Mara Ellery, his fiancée. The man hearing them was Julian Voss himself, crouched on a cold sidewalk in torn clothes and a fake beard only 9 days before their wedding. He had disguised himself as a beggar to test her heart. A billionaire, pretending to have nothing, desperate to know if Mara loved the man beneath the name or only the fortune attached to it. But Julian thought he was the one exposing the truth. He had no idea the truth had been waiting for him for 22 years. And the secret Mara carried was not betrayal. It was the reason his mother never came home. If stories like this one stay with you long after they're over, make sure you're subscribed. New stories drop every week and you won't want to miss what's coming next. The pre-wedding party was held at the Voss Estate's East Terrace, dressed in white linen and candlelight that made everything look more delicate than it was. Roughly 80 guests, old money and new, the kind of crowd that could talk about nothing for hours while communicating everything that actually mattered. Julian stood near the bar with a glass of scotch he had stopped pretending to drink. He was watching Mara the way he always did in rooms like this, quietly, from a distance, cataloging. The way she moved, the way she laughed at precisely the right moments, the way she made each person she spoke to feel like the most important person in the room, and then moved on without leaving a trace of herself behind. She was extraordinary at this. He had never been entirely sure whether that unsettled him or drew him closer. He heard her voice before he located her in the crowd, clear, unhurried, carrying across the terrace with the ease of someone who had never once questioned their place in a room like this. Julian isn't the kind of man who could ever lose everything. He turned. Mara stood near the garden wall with her friend Dana back half toward him, unaware she had an audience. She wasn't performing. She wasn't saying it for his benefit. She said it the way someone states a fact about the weather. Julian set his glass down. It followed him upstairs into the quiet of his office where he sat alone with all the lights off. What she hadn't said was what undid him. She hadn't said, even if he did, I'd still love him. She'd built her certainty on his wealth like it was load-bearing, and only now, alone in the dark, did he understand how different that was from what he had needed to hear. He picked up his phone and called Graham Sutter. Graham had worked for the Voss family for 11 years, discreet, unshakable, and the only person Julian trusted with something this specific. What Julian asked of him that night was simple: help him look like someone else for a few hours. Find clothes worn enough to be believed. Keep the car around the corner and out of sight. Graham didn't argue. He'd seen enough of the Voss family to understand that some requests weren't questions. By the following morning, Julian no longer looked like himself. The jacket was torn at the shoulder seam. The boots had someone else's wear in the soles. The false beard was slightly uneven, which turned out to be more convincing than a neat one. He positioned himself on the pavement in front of Hargrave Square, the upscale shopping district, where Mara met her wedding coordinator every Thursday, and he waited. He had been in this place before, in a different way. Years ago, before the weight of the Voss name had fully settled on him, a woman had mapped every decision she made around his net worth. He'd been 26, young enough to still believe that being chosen was the same as being loved. By the time he understood the difference, the damage had already taken shape, a fault line running through everything he built afterward, invisible until pressure found it. He told himself this test was reasonable. He told himself any man with his history would have done the same. He waited. Mara arrived at 10:30, unhurried as always, carrying a coffee, and moving with the ease of someone who had never once needed to rush. Beside her walked Celine Archer, her closest friend since college, chosen as maid of honor, without hesitation. Celine had a particular quality that was rare. She was warm and deeply precise at the same time. She could read a room as quickly as she could read a person, and she was rarely wrong about either. She was talking with her hands as they walked, working through something with animation, while Mara listened with the particular stillness that meant she was actually paying attention. Julian kept his head down as they approached. Mara almost continued walking. Then she stopped. "Hey." Her voice was quiet and direct. "When did you last eat?" He gave a vague answer. Yesterday morning, maybe. He kept his eyes down. She crouched. Not bending politely at the waist, the way people did when they wanted to register concern without getting close. She actually crouched down to his level, rested her forearms on her knees, and looked at him like his answer genuinely mattered to her. She opened her wallet and folded 2 bills into his hand. Then she reached into her bag and produced a small card, plain white, handwritten in blue ink. Harbor Grace Center, she said. On Delmore Street. They'll have a hot meal tonight, and a clean place to stay if you need it. Ask for Ronan. He's usually there most evenings. She touched her hand briefly to his shoulder, and walked on. Julian looked down at the card. He had prepared himself for distance, the practiced warmth of public charity, a dollar slipped without eye contact, a murmured good luck designed to close the interaction as quickly as it opened. He had not prepared for her to crouch. He had not prepared for the card worn at the corners like it was one of several she regularly carried. He had not prepared for the name. Ronan. He didn't know who that was yet. He filed it away. Selina had kept walking when Mara stopped, but she'd turned back. She wasn't watching Mara. She was watching him. Not with recognition, not quite, but with the focused attention of someone whose instincts had snagged on something they couldn't yet name. Her eyes dropped briefly to his hands. His hands were too clean. His nails too even. A man who had been living rough didn't have hands like that. Her gaze moved from his hands to his face and held there a beat longer than it should have. She didn't say anything. She turned and followed Mara, and Julian kept very still until they were far enough ahead. 12 minutes later, Lenora Ellery arrived. She stepped out of a black town car with the composure of a woman who had spent 50 years making entrances, spotted her daughter on the pavement, and crossed the distance with the measured pace of controlled urgency. Lenora was the kind of woman whose emotions never moved quickly. Everything was filtered, contained, translated into something more useful before it reached her face. She spoke to Mara low enough to seem private. "We are 9 days away," Lenora said. "You know what that means. One photograph taken out of context follows you for years." "He was hungry," Mara said. "That is not your responsibility today." Lenora's voice dropped lower, which made it sharper. "You are about to marry into one of the most scrutinized families in this city. You cannot let sentiment override judgment." Julian watched from where he sat. He expected Mara to yield. She was skilled at these negotiations with her mother. A small concession offered gracefully, the tension dissolved before it could calcify into something harder. He had always admired that in her. The precision of it. Instead, Mara reached into her coat pocket and brought out her engagement ring. She'd taken it off before crouching down, a small private habit Julian hadn't noticed until this moment, and she turned it once in her fingers before she spoke. "If wearing this ring means I can't sit with a hungry man without it becoming a liability," she said, "then I think everyone here has misunderstood what I'm about to promise." She closed her hand around the ring and slipped it back into her pocket. Lenora said nothing. The silence between them had the weight of something that had been accumulating for a long time. A few feet behind them, Celine stood watching. She was no longer looking at Lenora. She was not looking at Mara. She was looking directly at Julian. Her expression had settled into something resolved. Whatever she'd been working out in the last few minutes, she had worked it out. Julian could see it in the stillness of her face, not accusation, not alarm. Just a quiet, unreadable certainty. He had positioned himself here to measure Mara Ellery. The problem was that somewhere in the last 20 minutes, without designing it that way, the measuring had gone both ways, and he was no longer sure who had come out worse. Harbor Grace Center sat on the quieter end of Delmore Street, between a laundromat and a closed-down print shop, in the kind of building that had been repurposed so many times, it had forgotten its original function. The sign above the door was hand-painted. The lights inside were on. Julian arrived an hour after Mara, still in the disguise, and found a reason to linger near the entrance. A man was stacking folded blankets by the front step, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone doing a task he'd done several hundred times before. Julian recognized the type, not staff, not quite a regular, a volunteer. He asked if there was somewhere a person could sit for a while. The man told him to go on in. What Julian had expected, and he understood now that he'd been expecting it, without quite admitting it, was the particular texture of charity performed for an audience. A bright room, deliberate and staged, designed to register as warmth without actually producing it. Mara Ellery moved in curated spaces. That was simply true. He had watched her do it for 2 years. What he found instead was a room where she had her sleeves rolled to the elbow, standing behind a long folding table beside 2 older women who were calling her by her first name and asking her opinion on how much salt was too much salt. She had an apron tied at the back in a knot that had been redone twice, judging by the loose ends. There was nothing curated about any of it. A child of about 7 ran to her from across the room and grabbed her around the middle without warning. Mara didn't step back or redirect the contact. She just steadied herself and pulled the child closer without breaking the conversation she was having. Julian sat down along the far wall and stayed there. An older man eventually settled into the chair beside him, broad-shouldered, moving carefully, the way men move when a body has been through serious use. He introduced himself as Walt. He'd been coming to Harbor Grace for 3 years, he said, since he got back from his second deployment and found that the apartment he'd been paying rent on from overseas had gone to someone else. Julian asked him carefully how long the place had been running. Walt said they'd been operating out of this building for about 6 years. The woman over there, he nodded toward Mara, had been coming since before that. She'd started when they were still running out of a church basement on the north side. Julian did the math quietly. Before she had met him, before the Voss name was attached to anything in her life, she had been doing this in a church basement before she ever knew he existed. She's good people, Walt said, with the plain conviction of someone who was not offering a compliment so much as reporting a fact. Doesn't make a thing out of it either. That's how you know. Julian said nothing. He was looking at Mara, who was now cross-legged on the floor with 3 children and a picture book, reading at a volume calibrated precisely to hold a 7-year-old's attention without losing a 4-year-old's. The question that had brought him here was supposed to be, does she love me or does she love the name? He was no longer standing anywhere near that question. He was standing somewhere colder and more confusing. If she was genuinely this person, if all of this was real and had been real for years, then why had she hidden every trace of it from him? He got his answer that same evening, and it was not the kind of answer that settled anything. He had stepped outside for air when his phone buzzed. He looked down out of habit, then became very still. Through the propped open side window, he could hear Mara on her phone in the hallway. Her voice was low, but not whispering, the tone of someone having a serious conversation in a space where they believed they had privacy. "He can't know before the wedding," she said. "If he finds out before I have a chance to explain it properly, everything falls apart." A beat. She was listening to whoever was on the other end. "I know," she said, quieter now. "I know how long it's been. But if he hears it the wrong way from the wrong person at the wrong time, I lose any chance of making him understand." The call ended. Julian stood against the exterior wall and did not move for a long time. The question had changed shape again, and this new shape was sharper. The woman inside was not hiding a secret life of selflessness. She was hiding something specific, something with a timeline, a wrong person, a wrong moment, something that could be heard incorrectly, something that required careful management before a wedding that was now 8 days away. He had come here to determine whether Mara loved him or his money. What he found instead was a woman he could not make fit into any single frame he held up to her. And the space between those two versions of her, the one reading to children on the floor and the one making careful phone calls about what he couldn't be allowed to know, was the most unsettling terrain he had ever tried to navigate. Over the next 2 days, Julian followed the threads. He was careful and methodical. These were the skills the Voss name had required of him since he was old enough to understand what it meant to have something worth protecting. He pulled records without touching anything that would leave a trace. He watched from distances that maintained plausibility, and gradually, the shape of Mara's hidden life became visible. She gave money to a children's scholarship fund under the Ellery family account. She had been donating to a pediatric wing at St. Carver's Hospital for 4 years, again under the family name, not hers. She visited the hospital regularly, but not as a benefactor making appearances. She went in, sat with children, and left without anyone photographing her doing it. There was a woman named Maris Vale, older careful, who met Mara twice a month at a small cafe on the east side. Each time, Maris brought a worn leather folder and slid documents across the table that Mara handled with the focused attention of someone reviewing something that could not be gotten wrong. Maris had the particular bearing of someone who had witnessed something significant a long time ago and had been living alongside that knowledge ever since. Whatever passed between them during those meetings, it was not casual. It was the business of people who shared a weight they hadn't chosen. And then there was Ronan Bell. Julian had filed the name away on the first day. Now he pulled it forward and held it in the light. Ronan Bell was a physician, specifically a pediatric specialist, who had worked at St. Carver's for over 2 decades. He was not young and not particularly remarkable in appearance. A man in his late 50s who moved with the particular gravity of someone who had spent a long career delivering difficult news to parents of sick children. He and Mara spoke with the ease of people who had known each other for a long time, not intimately, not romantically, but with a weight between them that was unmistakably significant. Julian watched them meet outside the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon. Ronan carried an envelope, old manila, the kind that had been handled and rehandled until the corners had softened. He gave it to Mara without ceremony. She took it with both hands. She opened it alone, sitting in her car, and Julian watched from across the street as she went very still. Whatever was inside the envelope, she had seen its contents before. This was not surprise. It was the reopening of something that had been closed for a long time and never fully healed. She sat in the car for 11 minutes. Julian counted. When she finally drove away, he crossed the street and stood where she had been. The envelope was gone. Whatever it contained, she had taken it with her. That evening, back at Harbor, Grace Julian was present when Mara crouched beside a boy of about 9 who had scraped his knee on something outside. She cleaned the cut with practiced efficiency, talking to him the whole time in the steady, unhurried way she had with children. As she finished taping the bandage, the boy asked her if she was scared about getting married. Mara said she was a little bit. The boy asked why. She smoothed the edge of the bandage with her thumb and answered in the careful way adults answer when they're choosing honesty over reassurance. "Because the person I love doesn't know everything about me yet," she said. "And I just hope that when he does, he doesn't end up hating me." The boy told her that if the man was nice, he probably wouldn't. Mara smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that arrived before she decided to have it. "I hope you're right," she said. Julian, 3 feet away with his back against the wall, looked at the floor and said nothing. He had taken the disguise home that night and stared at it laid out on the bathroom counter. The torn jacket, the false beard, the boots that belonged to someone else's life. He thought about what he'd built over the past 5 days, a surveillance operation run against the woman he was supposed to marry in 1 week, conducted from behind a false identity he'd constructed because he overheard a sentence at a party. It was becoming increasingly difficult to describe this as wisdom. He was standing at the edge of something he couldn't take back when his phone buzzed. It was Celine. "We need to talk. Not over the phone. Tonight if possible." He met her at a coffee shop 3 blocks from his office. She was already there when he arrived, both hands around a cup she wasn't drinking from, and she looked at him across the table with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. "I know it was you," she said. "On the pavement outside Hargrave Square. It took me 2 days to be sure, but I'm sure." Julian didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. Celine set down her cup. "I'm not going to tell her. That's her news to receive, and it should come from you." She let that land before continuing. "But I need you to understand something about what you've been doing. You built a test because you were afraid she didn't love you. And what you found is a woman who has spent years giving away time and money to people she'll never get anything back from, quietly under other people's names in church basements before she ever met you. Julian said nothing. She has a secret, Celine continued. I don't know all of it. She's never told me everything, which tells you how heavy it is because she tells me most things. But whatever it is, she's been trying to find the courage to tell you herself. She's not hiding it because she wants to protect herself. Celine's voice was level, without anger and without comfort. She's hiding it because she's terrified of what it does to you. She stood and picked up her coat. You can keep following her, she said. You can keep building your case. Or you can go to her and listen as someone who loves her, not as someone who's already decided what he's going to find. She pulled on her coat with the finality of someone closing a door. But if you wait too long and it comes out the wrong way through the wrong person, don't put that on her. You had chances. She walked out. Julian sat with his coffee going cold and understood that he had already decided somewhere in the last hour that Celine was right. He would go to Mara. He would take off the disguise, and he would tell her what he'd done, and he would listen to whatever she needed to say. He took out his phone to text Graham and ask him to bring the car around. Graham's reply came before he could type a word. Mr. Voss, your father has asked to see you. He's called Miss Ellery and Dr. Bell to his office tonight. I think you should come. Julian read the message twice. His father. Alistair Voss, who had known about the disguise from the first day, because Graham Julian now understood with cold clarity, had always been his father's man first. Who had watched Julian dismantle his own life in slow motion over the past 5 days and said nothing. Who had apparently decided tonight that this was the moment. Julian put his phone in his pocket and walked to his car. Whatever chance he'd had to control how this ended, he understood it was already gone. Alistair Voss kept his private office on the 14th floor of the Meridian building, a room that had always felt less like a workspace and more like a courtroom. Dark wood, high ceilings, the particular silence of a place where consequential things had been said and then never spoken of again. Julian arrived to find the door already ajar. His father stood at the window with his back to the room. Mara sat in one of the 2 chairs across from the desk, very straight, her hands in her lap. Ronan Bell stood near the wall to the left, holding his coat over one arm, watching Alistair with the careful expression of a man waiting to see what kind of damage was about to be done. None of them had noticed Julian in the doorway. He stayed there. Alistair turned from the window. He was 71 years old and had never lost the quality of occupying a room completely. Every space he entered arranged itself around him without his having to ask. I've already told Ronan why I called you both here, Alistair said to Mara. His voice was measured, not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it had been cold. Julian has been investigating your life for the past 5 days. He knows about the center. He knows about the donations. He knows about the envelope. He moved to his desk and placed one hand on the surface. He doesn't know what's in it. But he will, one way or another. I'd rather it come from you than from whatever he pieces together on his own. Mara's voice was quiet. Alistair, please. You've been carrying this for 22 years, her future father-in-law said. So have I. It ends tonight. If he hears it now here like this. Mara's voice broke slightly and then steadied. He'll hate me. You know he will. I know what he'll do if he finds out in 5 years, Alistair said. I've lived long enough to know that the longer a true thing stays buried, the more damage it does when it surfaces. I did you no kindness by asking you to stay silent. I understand that now. Ronan spoke from his position near the wall. Mara. His voice carried the weight of a long shared history between them. It's time. In the doorway, Julian did not move. He understood in the way a person understands something they have been moving toward, without knowing it, that this was the moment the last 5 days had been building to. Every thread he had followed. Every window he had stood outside of. Every silence he had measured. They all ended here. Mara looked at her hands. When she began to speak, she spoke slowly, the way people speak when they have rehearsed something so many times that the rehearsal itself has become a kind of grief. 22 years ago, she was 17 years old. Her father was driving them home from her grandmother's house on a night when the rain had been falling for 6 hours, and the roads in the Hill District had gone unreliable. The bridge on Carver Pass, old narrow, the kind of infrastructure that had been on a list somewhere for years, gave way partially under a truck that had crossed just ahead of them. Their car went sideways. Her father couldn't open his door. The water was rising. A woman stopped. She had been driving in the opposite direction. She pulled Mara out first because Mara's door could be opened and her father's couldn't, and she told Mara to get to the guardrail and hold on. Then she went back into the water for her father. She got him out. She had actually gotten him out. He was on the surface. He was conscious. He was moving toward the bank. Then the remaining section of the bridge came down. Julian's hand found the doorframe. The woman's name was Katherine Voss. She was 44 years old. She had been on her way home from a benefit dinner in the next county alone in the car, and she had seen 2 people in trouble, and she had stopped without hesitation. She did not survive the collapse. Mara's father lived. Mara lived. Katherine Voss did not. Mara finished speaking, and the room was completely still. Ronan was the physician on call that night at St. Carver's, she continued. He was the one who sat with me in the waiting room until morning when they told me my father would recover. He was the one who explained to me what had happened to the woman who saved us. Her voice was steady now, the way things are steady after they have already broken. I never knew her name until Ronan told me, and when he told me I understood what I had to carry. From the doorway, Julian said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Mara went rigid. She turned. He was still in the disguise. The torn jacket, the false beard, the boots. He stood in the doorway of his father's office looking exactly like the man she had crouched beside on the pavement outside Hargrave Square, and the recognition that moved across her face was not a single emotion. It was several arriving in sequence, each one worse than the last. She stood up slowly. "How long?" she said. "The first day." His voice was not steady. "Outside Hargrave Square. That was me." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones that had come before. It was not the silence of something unsaid. It was the silence of something understood completely. "You were testing me," Mara said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She turned away from him. One hand came up to cover her mouth briefly, then dropped. When she spoke again, her voice was very controlled, which was more devastating than if it had collapsed entirely. "I spent 5 days trying to find the courage to tell you the truth. And you spent 5 days following me to find out what I was hiding." Julian crossed the room. He pulled off the false beard and dropped it on the desk. Without the disguise, he looked exactly like himself, which was he understood precisely the problem. "I was afraid," he said. "That's not a justification. I'm telling you the truth because I'm done offering you anything other than that." He looked at her directly. "I was afraid you were with me for what I had, and I turned that fear into a test instead of a conversation. I made you the defendant in a case I'd already decided to prosecute." Mara looked at him for a long moment. "I wasn't hiding it to hurt you. I was hiding it because I have been terrified since the day I understood who you were, that you would look at me and see the person who was on that bridge when your mother died." "You were 17, Julian said. "I know how old I was. You didn't put her in that water. I know that too." Her voice finally fractured just at the edges. "I know it here." She touched her temple. "I have never fully known it here." Her hand moved to her chest. Ronan Bell set his coat over the back of the empty chair and spoke with the careful authority of someone who had been waiting 22 years for permission to say what he knew. He told Julian about the night at St. Carver's. Not the medical details, those weren't his to give anymore. He told him about a 17-year-old girl who sat in a plastic chair in a hospital waiting room for 7 hours alone because her father was in surgery, and there was no one else. He told him about the moment she understood that the woman who had pulled her from the water was not going to come through the same doors her father had come through. He told him what it looked like when a person receives news that permanently restructures the architecture of their life. Your mother made a choice, Ronan said. A free choice made in full possession of herself at 44 years old. She saw two people in trouble and she did not drive past them. That is the complete story of what happened on that bridge. He looked at Julian steadily. Mara did not take your mother from you. Your mother gave herself, and the direction she aimed that gift happened to include Mara. If you turn that into a debt, you reduce the most generous act of your mother's life into a transaction. And I don't believe that's what Katherine Voss would have wanted done with it. The room held that. Alistair moved from his desk and stood near the window again, but differently now, not commanding the room, just occupying it. A man his age, carrying more than his body, looked built to hold. I should have told you years ago, he said. He was speaking to Julian, but his eyes moved briefly to Mara as well. When you were old enough to understand, I should have told you the truth about how your mother died and who she saved. I told myself I was protecting you. I was protecting myself. He said it plainly, without self-pity, which was the most honest Julian had ever heard him speak. I watched you grow into a man who trusted no one and called it wisdom, and I never once considered that the silence I kept might have had something to do with that. Julian drove to the river. He didn't plan to. He was simply driving, and the car went where some part of him had already decided to go to the stretch of riverbank on the south side of the city where his mother used to take him when he was small to watch the water and eat crackers from a paper bag and talk about nothing in particular. He hadn't been there in years. He went now in the middle of the night, still carrying the torn jacket over his arm. He sat on the concrete barrier above the water and let the full weight of the last 5 days settle onto him without trying to manage it. He had been angry at Mara for keeping the secret. That anger lasted about 4 minutes before he understood it had nowhere to stand. She had been 17 years old and had never been given the tools to carry what had been placed on her. She had spent 2 decades doing quiet, unremarked good in the world, not to earn forgiveness, because forgiveness wasn't his to give, but because it was the only language she had found for living with what she knew. She had come into his life already shaped by this, already trying. He had been angry at his father. That one was more durable and more complex, and he understood it would take longer than one night to work through. He thought about his mother. He could remember her hands most clearly, the specific way she moved them when she was talking about something she cared about. He had a photograph of her on his desk taken a year before she died, standing in a garden, looking at something outside the frame. He had always wondered what she was looking at. He still didn't know. What he knew now was that whatever she had been looking at, she had not been the kind of woman who drove past a collapsed bridge with people in the water. He had known that in some form his whole life. He had simply never held it directly next to her death before, never allowed the two things to be the same thing. She had not been taken. She had gone towards something. That understanding did not close the wound, but it changed the shape of it in a way that made it possible to stand up from the concrete barrier walk back to the car and drive to Mara. She answered the door still dressed, which told him she hadn't slept either. He stood in the hallway and looked at her, and he said, I'm not going to ask you to forgive what I did. I'm going to tell you that I understand it was wrong, and I understand why it was wrong, and I am not the same person tonight that I was 5 days ago. He held her gaze. I'd like to know if you're willing to let me be this person instead. Mara looked at him for a long time. I'm still angry, she said. I know, not just about the disguise. She crossed her arms, not in defense, but in the way of someone holding themselves together while they figure out how to say something true. I'm angry that you looked at me and saw a suspect, that after 2 years that was still the frame you reached for. Yes, Julian said. That's the one I have to answer for. She studied his face. Whatever she was looking for, she found enough of it. She stepped back from the door and let him in. 3 months later, they were married at Harbor Grace Center on Delmore Street. There was no white linen, no candlelight engineered for effect, no guest list curated for optics. There were folding chairs and paper lanterns, and 3 children from the center who insisted on carrying flowers and did so with tremendous seriousness. Walt was there in the one jacket he owned. Maris Vale sat in the second row and cried from the opening words she had waited 22 years for the day when what she knew could finally be carried by more than just a few people in a quiet room. Ronan read a short passage about forgiveness, not the kind that pretends the wound was nothing, but the kind that refuses to let the wound be the last word. Celine stood beside Mara and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said between them. Alistair stood at the front of the room and spoke about Katherine Voss. He told the story the way it deserved to be told, not as a tragedy that had defined everything that came after, but as a portrait of a woman who had understood in the moment that counted exactly who she wanted to be. He did not cry. He had already done that alone before he came. Julian looked at Mara and understood for the first time without reservation what she was. She was not the reason his mother was gone. She was the person who had carried his mother's last act of generosity inside her chest for 22 years, who had tried to be worthy of it in the only way she knew how, and who had loved him anyway, in full knowledge of what that love risked. The test he had designed to measure her had not found her wanting. It had found him standing in borrowed rags outside a room she'd been building for years, and asked him very quietly what kind of man he intended to be. He was still working on the answer, but he was working on it honestly, which was the only thing that had ever mattered. Julian spent years believing the most dangerous thing a man could lose was money. He was wrong. The most dangerous thing to lose is the ability to trust, because once you start treating the people who love you like suspects, you stop being someone worth loving back. Old wounds don't justify new cruelty. Fear doesn't make a test reasonable. And the truest thing this story leaves behind is simple real love doesn't need to be proven. It just needs to be met with the same courage it was offered with. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about Julian and Mara, about what we do to the people we love, when we're afraid, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. There are more stories like this one coming, and you won't want to find them after everyone else already has.